Thank you. The bulk of the talk is going to be a survey of the major ecosystems here in northern Illinois and the different butterflies that live in these different ecosystems. And finally, I'm going to conclude the talk by saying a few things about conservation. So this is a prairie. This is actually a prairie not terribly distant from here. This is Nechusa grasslands out in Dixon, Illinois. And if you've never been there, this is a marvelous place to visit. This is what most people think of when they think of a prairie: a big open expanse of grassland with flowers growing in it and a great deal of species diversity. As it turns out, at Nechusa grasslands, there are some wonderful butterfly species that can be observed there. And these butterflies are not found in many other places in Illinois. Why would that be the case? And here's the question I want to pose for this talk. Why is it that some butterflies require these high-quality, tiny remnant native preserves and are not adapted to the broader landscape, whereas other species of butterflies can be found right here in downtown Montgomery, for example? And the answer to that has something to do with the butterfly life cycle. So you can find butterflies even in urban areas like here in downtown Montgomery or in Lincoln Park in Chicago near where I work. So what I'd like to do is quickly review the butterfly life cycle. And most people do this with the monarch. If you've seen a treatment of the butterfly life cycle, you've probably seen the monarch used as an example. So just for something a little different, I thought we would use an endangered species to illustrate the butterfly life cycle. This is called the swamp meadowlark, and this is an endangered butterfly from here in Illinois. And I'll talk more about its ecology and conservation a little bit later in the talk. But right now, I'd like to talk about its life cycle. So what I've shown here is the adult. This is what most people, this is the life stage that most people think of when they think of a butterfly. And this is the reproductive phase of the butterfly's life cycle. So I've illustrated that by showing a photograph of a mating pair here. Oops, wrong way. Now here is where the butterfly life cycle and butterfly ecology come together, because female butterflies will then lay eggs that will hatch into caterpillars. And caterpillars are very, very fussy about what they feed on. Frequently, there's only one or a few closely related plant species that are the only types of leaves that caterpillars can eat. In the case of the swamp meadowlark, the host plant, and that's the plant that the caterpillars feed on, is this plant here, swamp thistle. Now, the females aren't concerned with the pretty blooming part of the plant here. They will lay their eggs down on the leaves because it's the leaves that the caterpillars are going to feed on. So these are eggs of a swamp meadowlark butterfly. And I apologize for the quality of the photograph here. The way I had to take this photograph, these are tiny. These are only about half the size of a sesame seed. And the female kind of glues them to the undersides of the leaves. So that's a swamp thistle leaf that you can see there that the eggs are on. And so the way I photographed this, I took a leaf with some eggs on it. I put it under the dissecting microscope. I took the eyepiece out of the microscope and pointed my camera lens down the barrel of the microscope and was able, with then cropping the image, to get this picture of the meadowlark eggs. It's not a great picture, but it does serve to show what they look like. They're these tiny little flattened discs and attractive dark pink in color. The female lays them only on swamp thistle, and after about 1 to 2 weeks, the eggs hatch and the caterpillars emerge. Oops, I'm going the wrong way again. And this is a swamp meadowlark caterpillar. I'm sorry, there's still a lot of light in the room, so it doesn't show up quite as well as I'd like. But you can see it's a hairy caterpillar. It's not very big at maturity. It's only about a ½ centimeter long. When they first hatch, you can only see them well in the dissecting microscope. They're very, very hairy, and they have this long row of hairs that stick straight up that run straight down the back of the caterpillar. It makes them look like they have a punk haircut. So the caterpillars eat and grow, and that is the main function of the caterpillar. It is the growth phase of the butterfly's life cycle. You've probably all seen a monarch caterpillar just before it hatches. It's about this long. It starts just a couple of millimeters in length, and so caterpillars grow very, very rapidly. The monarch, for example, the caterpillar attains its full size in about a month. If a human baby were to grow at the same rate as a monarch caterpillar, then a 4-week-old baby that had been born at normal size would be the size of a school bus. Now, unlike us, our bones are on the inside. Caterpillars and all insects have an exoskeleton, so their rigid supporting part is on the outside. This limits their ability to grow. So as the caterpillar eats, it doesn't really have a lot of room to expand. So after a while, it's gotten kind of all tight and crammed in under its exoskeleton, and the exoskeleton splits open. A new exoskeleton, a very soft one, has grown on the underside of the existing exoskeleton. The exoskeleton splits, the caterpillar crawls out, it expands, the exoskeleton hardens, and it continues eating. And it does this 4 or 5 times over the course of caterpillar growth. The last time that the caterpillar splits its skin, instead of another more spacious caterpillar coming out, this is what's on the inside. This is the chrysalis. Now, the chrysalis is the most misunderstood part of the butterfly life cycle. A couple of things. A lot of people confuse the term chrysalis and cocoon. Butterflies actually do not make cocoons. A cocoon is a structure that certain moths build. And so what happens with a cocoon is a caterpillar that's ready to split its skin that last time spins silk and uses the silk to draw together bits of leaves around it and creates a little, almost like a house. And then inside of that, the caterpillar splits its skin the last time. Well, butterflies never do that. They simply split their skin, and the chrysalis structure is underneath the skin of the caterpillar. So you will sometimes hear it spoken that butterflies spin their cocoons. Butterflies don't do that. Only some moths do. This is also not a house or a container or something that magic is going on inside of, any more than your skin is a container that stuff is going on inside of. This is the equivalent of the chrysalis's skin that you're seeing here. One of the other things that you sometimes hear about the chrysalis and metamorphosis is that inside, the animal completely turns to liquid, and then almost by magic, the adult butterfly emerges from that liquid. It's very romantic and beautiful to think of it that way, but it's also not really correct. What's actually happening is a lot of the structures that are present in the caterpillar are undergoing a genetically programmed type of cellular death called apoptosis. And as apoptosis is proceeding and the cells are being degraded, there is a lot of goo that does form inside of the chrysalis. But there's still structure in there, because from the very earliest stages of the caterpillar, as soon as it hatches out of the egg, there are present in its internal structures little tiny groups of cells called buds. And there are wing buds and antenna buds and leg buds. And during the chrysalis stage, these have been sitting quiescent through the entire caterpillar phase. These spring to life and begin dividing and multiplying and forming the adult structures. Eventually, a completely fully formed adult butterfly is present under the skin of the chrysalis. Its wings are tiny and very, very floppy and fragile, and its body is very fat. And so as soon as the chrysalis skin splits, this adult crawls out and it immediately begins pumping fluid from that very fat body into the wings. The fluid pressure expands the wings into their final shape. It hangs upside down and lets these very limp, soft wings that it can't fly on harden. That's actually a very vulnerable time for the butterfly because while its wings are still soft and wet, it can't fly, it can't escape from predators. This vulnerable stage lasts anywhere from a few minutes for very small butterflies to a couple of hours for very large butterflies like monarchs and swallowtails. Eventually, the wings harden, and you have a fully formed adult butterfly, and it can now fly, and it will take flight, begin seeking a mate, begin seeking nectar sources for food. One other thing about nectar sources that I'd like to say is that unlike the host plants, which are what the caterpillars eat, adult butterflies are much less picky about what they eat. It's just like us, it's the kids that are the picky eaters and the grown-ups eat much more. So throughout this talk, I'm going to repeatedly speak about what a given species eats. Unless I specifically say otherwise, I am talking about the caterpillar's food plants, because it's this very, very tight relationship between the caterpillars and the type of plants that they can feed off of that does a lot to dictate butterfly ecology. If the caterpillars feed on common plants that are found all over the place, then the butterfly will be found all over the place. In many cases, however, the caterpillar eats rare plants that are only found in special places like prairie remnants. These adult butterflies will also be confined to these very rare places. So what I'd like to do now is do a bit of a survey of ecosystems of the Chicago area and the butterflies that live there. And we're going to start with urban ecosystems. And it turns out that about 2/3 of the butterfly species that live in Illinois can be found in urban areas. The butterfly species in the Chicago region, there are about 110 of them. So about 60 to 70 butterfly species can be found in urban areas. Now, when I say urban, yes, I'm referring to certain places like Lincoln Park in downtown Chicago, but I'm also referring to any place that is human-dominated. So suburbs, villages, even agricultural areas all can fit in this broader category of urban for the purposes of this discussion. And so this is a black swallowtail, and black swallowtails are a great example of butterflies that have adapted to urban landscapes because butterflies that are well adapted to urban landscapes tend to have host plants that are either non-native weedy species, weedy native species, horticultural plants, and in some cases agricultural plants. So in the case of the black swallowtail, it is a combination of non-native weedy species that live in the area and, to a small degree, agricultural plants. This is Queen Anne's lace. Black swallowtails feed exclusively as caterpillars on members of the carrot family, and Queen Anne's lace is in the carrot family, and Queen Anne's lace is abundant everywhere, and this is the plant species that overwhelmingly is carrying the black swallowtail here and keeping it as a very abundant butterfly in the modern landscape. Now, I mentioned agricultural concerns here. It's not an economically important to agricultural pest, but it does feed on certain species that we grow for agricultural purposes. Carrots, yes, but in particular, you can often find black swallowtail caterpillars in an herb garden where they'll feed on things like dill and fennel and parsley. They seem to be particularly attracted to the smelliest members of the carrot family, and these are all herbs that have very strong fragrances to them. So this is a butterfly that you're not only very likely to see outdoors flying around in the summer, but you may even see the caterpillars in your garden if you grow herbs. Another very common butterfly in the Chicago area is the pearl crescent. Beautiful little bright orange butterflies. These feed on asters. Now, they will feed on very, very rare asters that grow in high-quality prairies and just about no place else. But they will also feed on much commoner, weedy native asters that are found in many places in the area. And in particular, this species here is hairy aster. And hairy aster grows in a lot of fairly dry places that don't have a lot of competition. So railroad embankments is a great place to find hairy aster, and you will find pearl crescents all over the place anytime you have a lot of hairy aster. One of the things that my photos don't show very well is size. The black swallowtail that we saw a moment ago is a fairly large butterfly. It's got like a 3 to 4 inch wingspan. Pearl crescents are small. Their wingspan is only about an inch, so they're only about that big. If you know only one butterfly in the entire world, this is it. This is the monarch. This is most people's favorite butterfly species. The monarch is incredibly well known across the world. A few years ago, I was at a seminar in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia. Now, Malaysia has just amazingly beautiful tropical butterflies flying all over the place with amazing wing shapes and dazzling colors. And when I was in Penang, which is one of the larger cities in Malaysia, driving through town, I was noticing several businesses that were using butterflies as part of the business logo. And 2 of the 3 businesses that I saw with butterfly logos were using the monarch as the logo. The monarch isn't even found in Malaysia. So this worldwide is a really, really iconic butterfly species. And I could give an entire talk on the monarch and its migration and some of the problems that are currently facing it, but that's another talk for another day. Whoops, I keep doing that. Okay. Monarchs, the caterpillars feed exclusively on milkweed. And there is a move today to propagate milkweed and to expand plantings of milkweed, and to more and more people are allowing milkweed to grow up in their yards. I know I have it in my yard. We didn't even have to plant it. It just showed up there spontaneously. Now, milkweed is one of the reasons that there is sometimes confusion between larval host plants and nectar resources, because in addition to being the kind of plant that monarch caterpillars feed on, milkweed flowers are great nectar resources for many, many species of butterflies, including monarchs, including swallowtails, including most of the butterflies that we're going to talk about today will avidly enjoy milkweed as a nectar source. And so there have been many occasions where I've seen in a newspaper or magazine article a picture of an adult monarch taking nectar on milkweed that says, "Monarchs require milkweed." Well, that's true, and the caterpillars do, but the adults don't. They'll take nectar on a lot of things, not just milkweed. Another very familiar butterfly, big, showy, very handsome butterfly, the tiger swallowtail. At its largest, this can actually be a little bit bigger than a monarch. It can have a 6-inch wingspan. These bright yellow wings with the tiger stripes on them are unmistakable. This is a common and familiar butterfly here in northeastern Illinois. Now, tiger swallowtails are not quite as fussy about their host plants as many butterflies. The caterpillars are able to feed on the leaves of a number of tree species. So they like tulip poplar, they like black cherry, they like ash. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this species within the city limits of Chicago, because up until recently there were a lot of ash trees available to be host plants, and quite a bit of evidence that the tiger swallowtails were abundant in Chicago and using the ash trees as host plants. Well, most of the ash is now dying because of the emerald ash borer. There are other resources for the monarch to use in Chicago, but they're not as abundant as ash, which was widely planted as a street tree. So I am anticipating that over the next few years, we will see within the city of Chicago itself that the tiger swallowtail will become less abundant than it is today. I don't think it's in any sort of danger of becoming an endangered species or going extinct or anything like that. There are a number of butterflies that have a relationship with lawns. And this is one of them. This is a really gorgeous butterfly called the buckeye. This is a medium-sized butterfly. It's smaller than a monarch, but bigger than a pearl crescent. It's a little bigger than the cabbage white butterflies that you commonly see flying about often in people's gardens. And this butterfly does not spend the winter up here in Chicago in any of its life stages. But it also doesn't migrate in the same way a monarch does. Over the next couple of months, as the hard freezes keep occurring further and further south as frost progresses, this butterfly will progressively die back to further and further south. By the dead of winter, it will be holding on the Gulf Coast, in the deep south, in the desert southwest. Next spring, as spring begins advancing its way up, it will begin gradually dispersing northward, breeding as it goes, and several generations in, they will reach Chicago. One of its host plants is a lawn weed called plantain. This is plantain. We're not talking about the thing that looks like a banana that you sometimes see in the produce section, which is also called plantain. This is a little lawn weed with shiny spoon-shaped green leaves, and the caterpillars of buckeyes feed on that. This is the plant that is keeping buckeyes very abundant, at least in later summer when it's up here in the Chicago area. Some butterflies eat the lawn itself. These are fiery skippers. This is another species that dies back in the winter and migrates up in the spring. And it eats a variety of grasses, including Kentucky bluegrass, which is the main grass that is grown in lawns. This butterfly used to be very rare in the Chicago area. It very seldom got up this far north, but beginning in the mid to late 90s, it started showing up in larger numbers and on a more regular basis. And there is some thought that we are seeing this as often as we do now as a reflection of global climate change and a warming planet. And finally, there are a couple of species of butterflies that feed on clover. This is one of them. If this were a big butterfly, this would be spectacular, but this butterfly has only got about a 3/4 of an inch wingspan, so it's tiny. This is called the eastern-tailed blue, and its caterpillars feed on clover. So it's very common in lawns. It particularly likes, the caterpillars particularly like feeding on the flowers and developing seed pods of clover. So in the city, I will see this like right up against the lake, against the riprap that lines the lake where the lawnmowers can't get in very well, and the clover in those little pockets is more likely to be able to bloom, and so the butterfly thrives a little bit better in those spots. This is an interesting illustration of change in cultural practices, certainly over my lifetime. Today, many people use these chemical lawn services that are very spray intensive, that really limit your lawn to being just grass. And lawns, when I was a kid, used to have a lot more that not only was allowed to grow in them, but were even encouraged to grow in them. I remember you used to be able to get bags of white clover seed to plant in your lawn to make for a more interesting and diverse lawn. And that would benefit things like the eastern-tailed blue. Now, I've mentioned non-native plants and the role that they play in keeping urban adaptive butterflies common. You might wonder, are there also non-native butterflies? There are, but not many. In the Chicago area, there are 3. This is the best known of the 3. This is the cabbage white. These are the little white butterflies. They're flying right now. You see them all over the place. They seem to be having a very good year this year. I'm seeing them quite abundantly in many places. As their name implies, caterpillars of this species feed on members of the cabbage family. if you have ever found a green worm in your broccoli, it is actually a caterpillar from this butterfly. This butterfly was first observed in North America and Quebec in 1863 and has since spread to cover the entire continent. It is a species that is very well adapted to following people around the globe and being something of an invasive because it's now found in many, many places where it is a non-native species and something of an agricultural pest. This is the European skipper. It feeds on grasses and prefers grasses like timothy, which is a Eurasian grass that is very widely used in pasture settings. It undoubtedly came over to this country on shipboard in bales of hay, probably as a chrysalis. So you think it spends the winter as a chrysalis. So you're in Europe, you're in a hay field, you get baled up into a bale of hay, put on shipboard, sent over to the New World. The hay is then taken off a shipboard. Before livestock can get around to eating it, the chrysalises emerge, and the butterfly has now the opportunity to establish a foothold in North America. This arrived actually in the late 1800s. And our final non-native species, you'd never know by its name. This is called the American copper, but it's probably not originally an American species. There are no known native host plant species for this butterfly. Its only known host plant in this part of the world is this odd little plant called sheep sorrel. Sheep sorrel grows in sterile areas that don't have a lot of competition. And it is thought that this butterfly came over to this country very early in colonial times on shipboard. And so hence people not realizing that it was not actually a native species until much later. Genetic studies have revealed that the American populations are most closely related to Scandinavian populations. So it probably came over from Scandinavia back in the 1700s sometime. Now, most of the butterflies in the area are urban adapted. So our section on the urban ecosystem is the biggest section. Now we'll see a smaller number of butterflies from various types of remnant native habitats. We'll start with prairies and we'll go down the moisture gradient. So we'll start with dry prairies. Here's an example. This is a beautiful little gravel hill prairie up in Elgin. And there are a number of butterflies that are adapted to gravel prairies or sandy prairies like what you'd find along the shores of Lake Michigan, other dry native ecosystems. Two of these butterflies are found in sand dunes along Lake Michigan and have the interesting feature that even though they're not particularly closely related, they fly in the same place at the same time. Both of these species fly very early in the season. They fly much earlier than most butterfly species. This is the hoary elfin. It lives at Illinois Beach State Park. It is an endangered species here in Illinois, and it feeds entirely on a low mat-forming shrub that lives out in the dunes called bearberry. Illinois Beach State Park is the only place in Illinois that has a large population of bearberry. There's one other tiny population that can be found up in Boone County. And so Illinois Beach State Park is the only location that you will find this butterfly. And you will find this butterfly flying as early as late April. And by the 1st of June, it's pretty much done for the year. So this is a very, very early species. This is a tiny butterfly that just flies very low over these mats of its caterpillar food plant. At the exact same time, in the exact same place, is this beautiful creature called the Olympia marble. Now, this butterfly in this picture is actually seen perched on its host plant. And this is an unusual case where both the adult and the caterpillars have a close relationship with the same food plant. The plant is called sandcress, and the caterpillars eat sandcress. The adult butterflies take nectar on it. That early in the season, there's very little up at Illinois Beach that's in bloom other than sandcrest. So this species is an important nectar resource for the adults, as well as being the host plant for the caterpillars. This butterfly is not quite as narrowly distributed as the hoary elfin. In addition to the dunes around Lake Michigan, it can be found in sandy prairies in the Kankakee area, down by Peoria, and over by the Mississippi River. So it's still a rare butterfly, but there are a number of places here in Illinois where you can go to see it. A butterfly that lives in gravel hill prairies, like the one I showed you a couple of slides ago, is the Gorgon checker spot. This is one of the species that we're working with trying to do captive breeding at the Nature Museum. It's sitting on its host plant here. This is purple coneflower. Purple coneflower are those purple daisies that you saw all over the dry hill prairie in the picture I showed a moment ago. This is a butterfly that really should be part of a lot of the gravel hill prairies here in Illinois, and we are hoping to find ways to be able to, using captive breeding in the laboratory, establish new populations of this butterfly on hill prairie restoration projects across northern Illinois. So moving down the moisture gradient now, mesic prairies. Mesic means neither really wet nor really dry. Mesic prairies often are kind of wet in the spring, but dry out over the course of the summer. This mesic prairie is dominated by blazing star, a beautiful plant of mesic prairies in Illinois. Mesic prairies are the prairies that were most likely to have been plowed under for agriculture, and so a lot of the butterflies that require them are now quite rare. There are several butterflies in a group called fritillaries that live in mesic prairies. And what fritillaries all have in common is that their caterpillars feed on violets. This is the silver-bordered fritillary. It lives in mesic prairies that are towards the wetter end of the spectrum. It's another species that we are working with trying to do captive breeding at the Nature Museum. It's one of the lesser fritillaries. The lesser fritillaries all have wingspans of 1.5 to 2 inches. The greater fritillaries have wingspans of 4 to 5 inches. This is the Aphrodite fritillary. It's one of the greater fritillaries. Both the silver-bordered and the Aphrodite fritillary are doing very badly along the southern edge of their range, and they may be declining in the southern part of their range, again, due to changes in climate. This is the rarest of the fritillaries here in Illinois. This is the regal fritillary. It is listed as a threatened species in Illinois. The regal fritillary formerly flew from extreme eastern Colorado and Wyoming all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, where it ranged from the Carolinas up to the Maritime provinces. Since the 1970s, east of the Mississippi River, this species has experienced an amazing collapse. There are still about 3 populations each left in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. This particular picture was taken at Nachusa Grasslands here in Illinois. Other than those 3 states, all of the other states that it formerly flew in east of the Mississippi River, it is now extinct in, with the exception of 1 population in Pennsylvania and 1 population in Virginia. Both of these are on military reservations. The caterpillars seem to prefer violets that grow in prairie situations, such as lanceleaf violet, which is its main host plant here in northeast Illinois. This is another butterfly that we are working with in the laboratory at the Nature Museum. Right now, today, we have 3 females in cages at the Nature Museum laying eggs. And we will be using the butterflies that we rear in the laboratory to start a new population in the Chicago region on a prairie restoration effort out near Markham. So finally, wet prairies. This is Bluff Spring Fen. Bluff Spring Fen is a place in Elgin that's very dear to me. I have been part of the stewardship team at Bluff Spring Fen since 1982. So this is the best wet prairie in Illinois, but recognize that is a completely biased evaluation on my part. Well, a number of plants that are characteristic of wet prairies are butterfly host plants. In particular, willows are good host plants for a couple of great species of butterflies, including this one. This is the Acadian hairstreak. What a beautiful butterfly. This is also a small butterfly. It only has about an inch wingspan. I think this would be famously beautiful if it were the size of a monarch. This is not a monarch. This, in fact, is another butterfly that feeds on willow. This is a viceroy. And viceroys and monarchs mimic each other. Now, you may have heard that monarch butterflies, because they feed on milkweed, which has a lot of toxins in it, are unpalatable to birds. And if birds eat monarchs, they vomit them up and they learn to avoid that color pattern. For many years, we thought, and viceroys are perfectly edible, but they look like monarchs, so they kind of get a free pass here because the birds have avoided their color pattern. Well, it wasn't until the 90s that somebody said, you know, everybody's always said that, but nobody has ever tested viceroys to make sure that they really are palatable. And willows have also a lot of nasty chemical compounds in them that could conceivably make birds vomit. And so they actually did the experiment, and lo and behold, viceroys also taste bad. So what this is actually a case, when you've got one thing tasting good and another thing tasting bad and they look alike, that's called Batesian mimicry. There's another type of mimicry where a lot of things that taste bad converge on a common color pattern, and this makes it more efficient for predators to learn to avoid one pattern, and all of the species that are in that pattern are then protected. That's called Mullerian mimicry, and that's the kind of mimicry that viceroys exhibit. Now, just out of curiosity, how many people can know how you tell apart a monarch and a viceroy? Okay, well, in a moment, everybody is going to be able to, because if you know the trick, it's actually very easy. And what you see, we've got a viceroy on the left and a monarch on the right. And if you look at the middle of the wing, you'll see on the viceroy a curved black line that runs right down the middle of the wing that is absent on the monarch. There it is. You can see it's present on the viceroy and absent on the monarch. And that line is present both on the under and the upper side of the wing. I'll go backwards here. You can see there's from the top, you can still see the line there. That makes this a viceroy. So now you can amaze your friends by saying, oh no, that's not a monarch, that's a viceroy, and here's how you know. Like many things, it really is easy once you know the trick. Okay. So other butterflies from wet prairies. This amazing creature is the Baltimore checker spot. And this is actually, it's not a huge butterfly, but it's a big-ish butterfly. It's got about a 3-inch wingspan. So you really notice these guys when you're in the field. And you can find them in various situations in a type of wetland called a fen. And their host plants grow, their host plants grow in fens. Their host plants are a plant that's in bloom right now called turtlehead. Turtlehead has these white blooms shaped like a turtle's head. Now, this is a really good example of the host plant having nothing to do with nectar resources. Baltimore checker spots fly from mid-June to mid-July. Turtlehead begins blooming at the end of August. So while the plants are around for the female butterflies to lay their eggs on, there's no way that this can ever serve as a nectar source for Baltimore checker spots, simply because the flight period and the blooming period have no overlap. This is probably my favorite butterfly from northeastern Illinois. It's an incredibly gorgeous butterfly. Several of the butterflies that live in wet prairies feed on sedges. Now, if you recall the picture I showed a few minutes ago of Bluff Spring Fen, you could see this big grassy area in the foreground. Almost none of the plants that you were seeing there were grasses. They are a group that tends to replace grasses in very wet situations. They're called sedges, and they have a number of botanical differences from grasses, and they are important host plants for a number of butterflies. This is the eyed brown. This is a butterfly that lives in many wet areas with sedges here in northeastern Illinois. And if you have a sedge meadow or another sedgy wet area, you are very likely to also find eyed browns in that setting. There are a number of skipper butterflies that also feed on the sedges. In more upland settings, the skippers that live in mesic and dry prairies tend to feed on grasses. The skippers that live in wetlands tend to feed on sedges. This one is called the black dash. Our final ecosystem type that we will look at is woodlands. This is Miller Woods down in northwest Indiana here. The blue flowers that you see in the foreground are wild lupin. And wild lupin is the host plant of our most notorious woodland butterfly, the Karner blue. Karner blues are a federally endangered species, and they used to be found at Miller Woods and in the Indiana Dunes and a number of other spots in northwest Indiana. In 2012, we had really odd weather conditions. If you recall, that was the year we had about a week of 80-degree weather in mid-March, and then we had a big drought through the summer. What that very early spring did is it caused the butterflies and their host plants to desynchronize. And when the butterflies emerged earlier than usual, the host plant was not yet up and there was nowhere for them to lay their eggs. This butterfly appears to have gone extinct in northwest Indiana that year. There are still populations in Wisconsin and Michigan, but this is a really vivid example of the way in which a change in climate may have negative consequences for many species, including butterflies. Another butterfly from woodlands of northeastern Illinois and surrounding areas is the silvery blue. This butterfly is also probably now extinct in the region, and also changing climate is cited as a plausible reason for the extinction of this species as well. We were at the extreme southern edge of its range, and it has retreated back further north from most of the southern edge of its range, which extends coast to coast. So this is a butterfly that may be part of our past and may or may not be part of our future. This is the caterpillar of a silvery blue butterfly. Its host plant is here, veiny pea. And I failed to mention at the beginning of the talk, all of the photographs, with one exception in this talk, are my own photography. This is the one exception. This picture was taken in the early 90s by Ron Panzer. It's very hard to find caterpillars of this species, so I am not anticipating anytime soon being able to find and photograph a caterpillar of silvery blue sitting on its host plant. So that brings to an end our survey of ecosystems of the Chicago region and the butterflies that live there. I hope that I've managed to convince you of the importance of the relationship between butterflies and their host plants. I'd like to close by just saying a few words about conservation. I've mentioned several species of butterflies that we are trying to rear in the laboratory at the Nature Museum. Here is the conservation lab at the Nature Museum. All of the cups that you see on the shelves over on the right-hand side of the picture have bits of host plant of a rare butterfly and caterpillars growing up in them. The way we do this work, I'll illustrate with this butterfly here. This is the swamp meadowlark. This is a butterfly that used to fly here in northeastern Illinois. It's restricted to fens. There are historical records from Bluff Spring Fen in Elgin, and we've done so much ecological restoration work there that we think we can bring this butterfly back to that site. We collect female butterflies, once again, Bluff Spring Fen. We put them in cages with sprigs of host plant. These here are regal fritillaries in cages with host plants, and they, the host plant stimulates the female butterfly to lay eggs, and in this case, she lays eggs on the mesh at the top of the cage. We harvest the eggs. We grow the caterpillars up. These are swamp meadowlark caterpillars, about 2-week-old and about 2-month-old caterpillars on the left and right, respectively. Eventually, they pupate, and we wait for the adult butterflies to emerge, bring them to the site where we are starting to, trying to create a new population and release them. This is a very exciting photograph. This is the first swamp meadowlark butterfly that has been seen at Bluff Spring Fen in over 60 years, when 2 years ago we did our first releases. We did another release last week. We will do more releases later this week and early next week, and we are really hoping to have an active population of swamp meadowlarks back at Bluff Spring Fen, and if that works well, at other fen sites here in northern Illinois as well, so we don't have all of our eggs in one basket. We're also working with new ways to carry caterpillars over the winter. This is a computer-controlled chest freezer that we are using to simulate winter conditions, and we will be trying that out for the first time this winter. Final thing I want to say something about is the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network. This is a citizen science program where people actually go out into the field and survey for butterflies. You get assigned a particular site with a particular walking route on it. You go out, you walk your route 6 times per year, and you record all of the butterflies that you see within 20 feet of yourself while you're walking your route. This has been an extremely successful program. We've just had a major publication come out about monarch butterflies that people have recorded while doing their surveys here in Illinois. If you want to find out more about becoming a butterfly monitor, our website is www.bfly.org, and that will tell you how to get started becoming a butterfly monitor. And we have events each year where monitors gather. It's a wonderful, fun program, but in addition to being fun, it's also producing a lot of valuable scientific data. So that's it. That's what I wanted to talk to you today. Thank you very much. I think I have time for a couple of questions. Yes. Mm-hmm. Painted ladies are still around Illinois. Painted ladies have an interesting population dynamic where they will go through years of extreme abundance and then years of much lower abundance. And we're in that part of the cycle at the moment, so that's what you're noticing. Yes? The average complete lifespan from egg to death of the adult is about 2 months. The average lifespan for an adult is about 2 weeks. There are lots of exceptions to that. The monarchs that migrate are an exception. The adults of the generation that migrates live about 8 months. Yes? We are going to be working with regal fritillaries and swamp meadowlarks. Yes? Actually, both this year and last year were pretty good years for butterflies. The difference between the two is that this year took a long time for them to get going. And so through the whole beginning of the summer, you weren't seeing much at all, and then things picked up later in the summer. Yes?
You talked a lot about association with particular ecosystems, like for instance, the gravel hill prairie and the, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, the Gorgon checker spot.
Yep.
So my question is, does the Gorgon checker spot care if it's a gravel hill prairie, or do they just need purple?
They seem to require both the host plant and a certain vegetative structure. And that puts them in dry prairies. It's not just gravel hill prairies, although here in northeastern Illinois, gravel hill prairies are the dry prairies that are most likely to have the right conditions for them.
So if you have a neighborhood, for instance, with enough purple coneflower in it, theoretically, it's enough to produce a supportive population.
Theoretically, but there's where the ecosystem structure comes in. Most organisms perceive neighborhoods as being savanna-like. We have trees, we have the houses actually are part of what is perceived as the ecosystem structure, and so it's a very different structure than a hill prairie. And so that's why, although neighborhood gardens and that sort of thing are wonderful about, often very effective at bringing a lot of butterflies in, they tend to bring in the butterflies that are already in the neighborhood rather than creating habitat for new butterflies that wouldn't otherwise be there. Okay?
How about the swamp meadowlark? You mentioned that its host plant is swamp thistle.
Yep.
Is it specifically just swamp thistle, or would some of the non-native or other native varieties of thistle also support swamp?
No, it is a very, very narrowly specific. There's a very closely related thistle called tall thistle that grows more in savanna environments. And further to the south, they are using that, and they also like somewhat shadier habitats. Probably a temperature thing also going along. But those two closely related thistles are the only species of thistle that if you offer them other thistles in the laboratory, they will die.
So a little different than my understanding of monarch relationship with milkweed. I mean, you showed common milkweed. Most people think of milkweed as common milkweed. There's swamp milkweed, there's butterfly milkweed, there's a bunch of different kinds of milkweed. It's my understanding that it will support monarchs in the larval stages.
Yeah, and that's true. And different species of butterflies have different degrees on how tightly drawn their host plant range is. So you get something like black swallowtails, and it's a bit further expanded even than monarchs. It can eat anything more or less an entire family of plants.
So you told him that, or us, that the butterflies are looking at our rooftops and seeing a savanna. They're not seeing what we're trying to create. What can the average person do to support butterflies?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said about supporting the butterflies that are in your neighborhood. You know, as I said, about 2/3 of the butterfly species here are adapted to urban environments. The good news is that by supporting butterflies that are already in your neighborhood, you're preventing them from, you know, declining and becoming endangered species. So a lot of what people are doing in their homes is more preventative than prescriptive medicine, if you want to use that kind of an analogy. And that's not to be underestimated as having conservation value. The other thing is, although it is still somewhat controversial, there is a fair bit of evidence that the monarch decline is associated with decline in milkweed. Milkweed is very easy to cultivate in garden settings. Monarchs have a very wide ecological range that they will tolerate. So, in fact, we've been getting a lot of reports over the last month. Monarchs have been laying eggs, and the eggs have been successfully developing all the way through in concrete planters along Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. So the other nice thing about milkweed in a home setting is that they will find you. A lot of times, like, you can't plant the wild lupin and get Carner blues because there's nothing close enough by that it would manage to find you. But monarchs will find you. So this is something that people can do that could have real conservation value.
I have flax, and boy, the butterflies are around the flax like crazy.
Phlox is an absolutely great nectar source for lots of species of butterflies. Yes? Yeah, OE is around. OE, there's not much you can do about it, with a couple of exceptions. I'm not a big fan of butterfly releases at weddings and funerals. Large-scale commercial production of monarchs can spread OE, and so that's why I don't advise supporting businesses that do monarch releases. OE is sort of a natural part of monarch's ecosystem, and other things being equal, it kind of waxes and wanes with them. If I were to make a list of things that I think are problems for the monarch, OE would be way down on the list. Yes. Well, if for breeding indoors, again, you do by, now most people who are doing it like you are as individuals, you're not really doing it to a point that's going to make enough of an impact with the OE to do anything large scale. But crowding is associated with increased transmission of OE. And so you've done exactly what I would suggest to reduce in a home rearing situation. You've spread your caterpillars out. All right, well, thank you very much. You've been a great audience.